Now, we were just looking at an introductory message last time on the subject of evolution. There are a couple of things that we still have to cover on this first page of your outline, and then we'll be through with that. The first page, which you can see all of this has just been introductory material that we've been in thus far, up until really up until this evening. We've been in a lot of introductory material. If you look on the second page of your outline, you see we begin with creation proper there. We start into Genesis 1. Now, what we're going to be doing under creation is looking at three different positions that can be held. B there, atheistic evolution, over on page 3. C, theistic evolutionism. Then we'll draw some conclusions on evolution. And then finally over on page 4, which is where we'll really get into Genesis 1 and 2, fiat creationism. So there's several pages that will just come under this subject of creationism. And we'll try to stay for the most part in Genesis 1, because you can see on page 5 we'll be going into anthropological creation and posterity, where we'll be studying of course the origin of man and his posterity, which will take us through several chapters there. Some of the words that I'll be using this evening in what we'll be saying are found here on your outline on the bottom of the first page and I guess the first half of the second page. So you want to keep that with you so you can spell any of the words that you don't know how to spell. We'll be looking at atheistic evolutionism, part 1 this evening. We'll finish it up next time, atheistic evolutionism. We'll spend a lot more time on theistic evolutionism, even though I have less material drawn up here on the outline. We'll spend a lot more time on theistic evolutionism and on fiat creationism, because, of course, both of these things are where we have Christians and Christian views involved. Here under atheistic evolutionism, just by definition, by the usage of the word there, this means non-Christian, so we're not going to spend just a whole lot of time here. We want to cover basically three things under this. We want to look at some philosophical views, some astronomical views, and some anthropological views. All this is there on your outline concerning the origin of the universe and the origin of man, philosophically, astronomically, and anthropologically. This evening we'll just be looking at some philosophical and astronomical views that deal with the origin of the universe. And the next time we'll be talking about Homo sapiens. That's what, of course, we are, men in general. We'll be looking at man's origin as far as what the atheistic evolutionists say. And you can already look ahead on the bottom of page 2 and see some of the exhibits that we'll cover: the Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal, the Piltdown man, these various men that are famous in biology textbooks even to this day. Some of them they've taken out because of some very interesting reasons they've had to take them out. But some of them, like your Kenya man, now he's one of the recent ones. These other ones are fairly old. Your Kenya man, he's still well known today. He's still around. And then the last fella, you see Gould's name there, Stephen J. Gould. He's a Harvard professor. He's still around today. He's a young fella, and he's come up with even a more recent theory than all of the people that have come so far before him. So this evening we'll be looking at atheistic evolutionism for the first time. We'll be looking at some naturalistic theories of cosmogony, philosophical theories, and some astronomical theories. The first thing that we have to do is finish up over on page 1, where I said that we need to discuss several terms here: catastrophism and uniformitarianism, that you'll see probably elsewhere on the outline, and especially you'll hear me say or you'll read in any of the literature that you're reading. So let me give you a definition, not dictionary definition, just a simple one that I've drawn up for you to help you understand what these two words mean: catastrophism and uniformitarianism. Just from the words, you ought to be able to get a hint of what they're going to be talking about. Catastrophism, catastrophe, well, both of these words have the same root or the same origin. Uniformitarianism is something is uniform. That means it doesn't change. It must not have been changed by a catastrophe at one time. So without even giving a definition, if you just look at these words, catastrophism and uniformitarianism, then you have some idea of what they are. First of all, catastrophism, because we are catastrophists, not uniformitarianists. We are catastrophists. Catastrophism is the belief in the cataclysmic disruption, alteration, and reorganization of the Earth's topographical features due to the universal Noachian deluge. It is the belief in the cataclysmic disruption, alteration, and reorganization of the Earth's topographical features due to the universal Noachian deluge. Now, do you understand what all of that means? No. Well, that was the non-dictionary definition. Let's go to the dictionary definition then. Well, what's a cataclysm? You don't know what that is. Something that's cataclysmic. It's like a catastrophe. It is something terrible that's taking place, okay? So you could put a catastrophe is taking place here. It's the disruption, and this is a progress. First of all, in Noah's flood, we have a disruption, an alteration of things, then a reorganization of the Earth's topographical features. Your topography is the land structure out there, your mountains, your hills, your rivers, your valleys, things like this. It's surface or it's geography due to Noah's flood. The universal Noachian deluge is generally what it's referred to as, the Noachian deluge. So catastrophism, the cataclysmic disruption, alteration, and reorganization of the Earth's topographical features due to the universal Noachian deluge. Now, do you understand that? Okay. Now, you see here on your outline, basically this word has to do, and the other word too, with the subject of Noah's flood. But I've added on here, I've given you just a little definition ahead of catastrophism on your outline. Recent creation flood geology school. Because basically, if a person is a catastrophist, then obviously he believes in flood geology. We don't believe in uniformitarian geology. We believe that the geology in the earth, the sedimentary structure, the levels of the various strata within the earth's sphere are all due not to the original creation, but they're due to the disruption, this cataclysmic disruption known as Noah's flood. So that's what flood geology is. We believe that the geology of the earth is based on Noah's flood. And what I've tacked on in front of that, you see, is recent creation. Because if you're a person who believes in a universal flood, which we do in Noah's day, then most likely 99% of the time you're also an individual who believes in a recent creation. In other words, not one that was several billion years ago. You believe in a recent creation several thousand years ago. So if you hold to these views, then you're a catastrophist, which is what we are, which is what Jesus teaches throughout the Gospels concerning the end times. He said it'll be like the days of Noah, and he talks about a flood that evidently went over the whole world at that time. Then what we are opposed to and what we have to come up against is uniformitarianism. And we'll be back on this in several whole messages to discuss where this originated. It's spoken of over in 2 Peter 3 as being a sign of the last days, which most people, when they call themselves a Christian geologist, they better be sure they read 2 Peter 3, because almost all of your geologists, with few exceptions, believe in uniformitarianism. And 2 Peter 3 says they're going to believe in uniformitarianism in the last days, which we'll look at that in a whole message. It doesn't call it uniformitarianism, but it means the exact same thing there. And he said that this will be a very sign of the last days, which is what we seek. So let me give you a definition of what uniformitarianism is. Obviously, as you see on your outline, it's going to be just the reverse of what catastrophism has been. Rather than a recent creation, a delayed maturation. That is, things have not come to a maturity instantly when God created things whole, but it's a process of evolution. And they believe in a local flood rather than a universal flood. So here's the definition of uniformitarianism. You need to get all this down because, well, let me just give it to you, then I'll explain. On a whole-scale basis, this is uniformitarianism. The earth and her features have remained the same from the very beginning until now. On a whole-scale basis, the earth and her features have remained the same from the beginning until our time. I'm getting ahead of myself, but let's just turn to 2 Peter 3 so I can show you where Peter says this very thing, that people in the last days would give up the view of catastrophism in favor of the view of uniformitarianism. 2 Peter 3. We'll just read one verse here, verse 4, because we have a lot to say when we come back to this subject later on. He said this is what the scoffers and the skeptics are going to say. 2 Peter 3:4, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. No change in anything. Everything has continued exactly the same up until today. We could take one example that all of you would be familiar with, and that is the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon would have had to have been formed at that very time when God created things, because it certainly couldn't have happened after then. Things have continued in the same process, which, of course, we believe something different about topographical features such as the Grand Canyon and Mount McKinley and Mount Everest and some of your high mountains like this. The Bible has some other things to say about where we got these land features like we have today. And the rivers, the different ways in which the rivers flow, and where rivers are found, and where deserts are found, and where your ice caps are found, and things like this. So this is where we would be opposed to what the uniformitarians have to say. And it's too bad that a lot of, like I said, your Christian geologists that claim to be Christians, but they're professional geologists, such as Dr. Young. We brought one of his books here. He claims to be a Christian geologist, but he, of course, believes in at least a modified form of uniformitarianism. Now, do you understand what I'm saying there? How things have continued in the same way. Now, they believe in local catastrophes. That's why they're part of the local flood school. Sometimes people in the creation movement have gone overboard to say that uniformitarians don't believe in any form of catastrophe, but they do. Because we have catastrophes that happen on a local basis even today. Floods, earthquakes that kill thousands of people, that alter the whole surface of the earth, in particular small portions, I might add. But what we do not have happening today is a universal change throughout the whole earth, a change in its structure everywhere. We're not having that today, not on any cataclysmic scale. Now, such things as soil erosion, of course, are taking place, but they're not talking about that, nor are we talking about that. That's on such a small scale, it really doesn't matter, because it's going to take a lot of soil erosion to get a Grand Canyon. I mean, it's just going to take a phenomenal amount of time. Or if it's being deposited somewhere to add up to something 29,000 feet high, which is what Mount Everest is. So we're talking about things on a large scale. And we'll be coming back to those words, so you need to understand what those words are and what they mean. Now, there are only three positions studying the origin of all things. I might sometimes mistakenly call it creation, because that's what we believe. But concerning the origin of all things, there are basically these three positions, as you see there on your outline. First of all, there's the position of atheistic evolutionism. Now, when you see the letter A in front of a word, when you've got a compound word like that, it simply means none or no. You just strike off whatever the rest of the word says. If it's theistic, that means you believe in a God. If you add an A to the word atheistic, then that means it erases what the rest of the word says, in other words. A person can be a moral person or an amoral person. It means you have no morals about you. You can believe in the millennium, or you can be an amillennialist. That means you don't believe in any literal millennium. So the first position is the atheistic evolutionism position. Secondly, theistic evolutionism. And then finally, fiat creationism. Now, unless you've studied in this area or read articles and books in this area, most people only would think of there being such thing as evolution and creation. You can only believe one of those things. You either believe in evolution or creation. But we know that the devil, he's much more subtle than that. So now we have atheistic evolutionism and theistic evolutionism. And the theistic evolutionism is the thing that's most dangerous to us today. The atheistic evolutionism is not really a major thing with us. We're going to deal with that in just a couple of messages. But under theistic evolutionism, we have such things as the gap theory. The gap theory is merely a form of evolution, which will all be over on page 3. 5 different theories supportive of theistic evolutionism. And the second one there that we'll spend probably a lot of time on is the gap theory, because that is a theory, an evolutionistic theory that people have invented today. And of course, those of you who've heard the tape realize that charismatics are teaching it. They don't really realize that they're teaching evolutionism. But that's exactly, in a nutshell, what they're doing. They are teaching a form of evolutionism. It's just that now we call it theistic evolutionism because these people that are teaching it believe in God. The fellow that you heard the tape by, he believes in God and prays to Him. So we couldn't call him an atheistic evolutionism, but he's a theist. He believes in God, but he still believes in evolution, doesn't believe in creation, not the way the Bible teaches it. Of course, the Bible position, the position that we believe and hold, is known as fiat creationism. Now, fiat is a Latin word that means a divine decree or a divine command that comes about suddenly. So you could just, there's really no way. You have to use the word fiat or you end up with a whole sentence on your hands. But we believe in a divine command that came from, of course, a divine being that created everything. This is what the word fiat means. I believe in America it's pronounced fiat, but this is a Latin word and it's pronounced fiat. Going back to Jerome's Vulgate, verse 3 of Genesis 1, you have, and God said, fiat lux, L-U-X, fiat lux, which is in Latin, let there be light. And this is where we got the word in the first place, over in Genesis 1 and verse 3, where the Latin version of the Bible says, and God said, fiat lux, let there be light. It's like, if you know anything about money here and United States currency, do you know what fiat money is? Do you know what, all of you probably got fiat money on you. You know what fiat money is? Well, if you've got any dollar bills on you, that's fiat money. If you have change on you, that's regular currency. But see, fiat money, it's only worth something because of a command that is made by the United States government. Now, if you've got coins in your pocket, they have copper and silver in them. They're worth something, and nickel in them. But if you've got dollar bills, that's nothing but a piece of paper worth nothing whatsoever. But it's because of a command of the United States government saying, now we say that this is worth $1. Let's say George there is worth $1. That makes that fiat money. And of course, fiat money is absolutely worthless. If you ever have, a terrible crisis in the country, then fiat money becomes nothing. You'd want to have some type of coins because it contains, of course, precious metals in them. So anyway, that's, I guess, a good way to explain it. It came by way of command of the United States government that money that you have in your pocket is worth something. And you see, you can all realize how gold would be worth something or silver, but not a piece of paper, unless someone tells you that is worth so much money. So it came by way of command, and this is the same thing with creation. It came by way of command from God. So if you've got ones and fives and tens, that's known as fiat money. Now last time, let's see, we got through Charles Darwin, I believed. Let me give you a little more information about Darwin, and I think this will about wrap Mr. Darwin up. I've already told you before that the only thing he studied to be was a minister, and he never made it at that. He eventually dropped out of divinity school, and he joined a ship by the name of the Beagle, B-E-A-G-L-E. He joined this ship known as the Beagle as the naturalist of the ship, and I believe he spent 5 years on this ship just traveling around the world. And it was while on this ship and their various stopping points in South Sea Islands and other places that he acquired quite a score of knowledge in the field of botany, plants and plant growth, as well as animals and the growth of animals, especially birds, that he noticed on these South Sea Islands, strange types of birds. And this is what gave him his thrust to really get into the area of evolution and begin to study that. Now, as I said, he's the most important name because of the book that he wrote. But his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, believed in evolution long before his grandson was even born. And Erasmus taught some of this to his grandson. Now, some of the names of phrases that Charles Darwin made famous were first of all coined by a man named Herbert Spencer, who lived a little bit before Darwin, Charles Darwin that is, and from whom Darwin obtained some of his material. But at least a couple of phrases that we can trace through extant literature show us that these phrases were coined not by Darwin, but before him by a fellow named Herbert Spencer. Two of these phrases, and you'll be familiar with both of these, are the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. Two very famous phrases. And sometimes just in your everyday conversation, you might use the survival of the fittest. Well, that came from this man named Herbert Spencer. But it was picked up by Darwin and used in his book. He had a subtitle. Of course, his book was on the origin of species by means of natural selection. He had a subtitle that I thought was interesting that I want to give you. A lot of old-timey books like that would have subtitles to the books. Some books still do today. But this was the subtitle of his book on the origin of species, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Or, O-R. He gave the name of the book, or, and this is his subtitle, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Now we'll see from Scripture that there's no such thing as race in the Bible. We are all part of the same race, and that is the human race. There's no such thing as a black race or a Japanese race. They're a different type of people, but we're all part of the same race, and that's the human race. And that's what the Bible says, that we all belong to the same race. We are just located in different places, and for a lot of reasons that I can't get into now, we have different physical and mental, intellectual, religious characteristics about us, due to a lot of extenuating circumstances. But it's interesting to find out the subtitle of his book, of course, is totally unscriptural, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And, of course, he got this title, you can tell, from one of those phrases that Spencer had coined, the struggle for existence. Now what we come to are some naturalistic theories of cosmogony. The first thing there on your outline under atheistic evolutionism. Some naturalistic theories of cosmogony. All of these now are atheistic theories. They're not believed by Christians. And, of course, the people that believe these are your worldly secular scientists, and so they don't even try to back anything up by Scripture. It's just when we get over into theistic evolutionism, looking at things like the day-age theory and the independent clause interpretation of Genesis 1, the gap theory, these different theories that we see later on in our outline, these are the people that try to use Scripture to back up their theories, and that's why we'll really have to go back to the Word to find out if what they're saying is right or wrong. Now, under these naturalistic theories of cosmogony, now cosmogony, remember, refers to the origin of the universe. We'll be looking at two different things: philosophical views and astronomical views. Because when we come down to next week looking at the origin of man, we'll be looking at some anthropological exhibits that the scientists offer for our scrutiny. So philosophical views and astronomical views. Okay, the first of two philosophical views that we will mention is known as dualism. D-U-A-L-I-S-M, dualism. Now this word, just like the words we looked at earlier, just look at the word and it's going to tell you it's talking about two something here because it says dual. And another thing I can mention about this word dualism, depending on how it's used, it means different things whenever it's used. But the book of Colossians and of course the book of 1 John were two books written against a very popular and a very famous heresy in the early Christian church during Paul's day and during John's day, known as Gnosticism, that we'll cover when we get to Colossians and 1 John. And it was the heresy of Gnosticism. And one of the beliefs under Gnosticism was dualism. We'll come up with the same thing again. What it's doing is playing God against matter. And under Gnosticism, G starts with a G, if you want to know how to spell it, then Gnosticism, G-N-O-S-T-I-C-I-S-M. Then under this, you'll have dualism that says that spirit is eternal, that matter is eternal, but that spirit is good and matter is evil. Now, this is not what we're coming to right now. That's just what we'll study under Gnosticism because it has a little different form. But here under this philosophical view of dualism, what dualism says is that God and matter are both co-eternal. Now, anytime we do come across this word dualism, it'll have to do, the two things, the dual things will be God and matter. It's just it'll have different meanings depending on whether you're trying to back up a philosophical view of cosmogony or an early church heresy, namely Gnosticism. God and matter are co-eternal. Now we're looking at a theory of the origin of the universe here. That's what cosmogony is. Then, of course, the next step that you have to take whenever you step beyond this in dualism, once you've said that God and matter are co-eternal, then the only thing that we can have is that either God or natural processes working in a natural, orderly way cause the universe to come about slowly and gradually. Now, God didn't speak anything. He didn't create anything. But since matter is co-eternal, either God took matter and just began to arrange it in a certain way and made a world, or God was completely out of it and just the natural processes began to take different molecules and chemicals and put them together, and we got our universe as a result of that. Now, of course, the whole falling down point here is to say that matter is co-eternal with God, which means that matter, of course, has had no beginning. And what they're trying to prove with this, without backing up any past this, what they're trying to prove is how we ended up with a universe like we have it today. Well, of course, the classic text for this is Hebrews 11:3. Through faith we understand the worlds were framed by the Word of God, and it's specifically the second half of Hebrews 11:3, so that things which are seen were not made out of things which do appear, which says that the world could not have been made out of matter, because matter, you get it large enough and it's got to be seen somehow. Even very small, it could be seen by at least God, even if we couldn't see it. So Hebrews 11:3 says that really can't be true. There's only one thing or being or essence or substance that's eternal, and that's Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God. We don't see in the beginning God took some matter and then he made a world from that. Just in the beginning God, period. There was nothing or no one else besides him in the very beginning. So the very beginning began to take some matter and formed a world out of it. believed by not that many people today, but so many people in your past pagan religions, your Greeks and your Romans, that God took something and formed a world, a globe out of it. Believed by so many people in the past. All I can say about this is it's very shallow, because it still doesn't answer the question, what about the very beginning, though? Assuming that God did take matter, the way we know the world today, the way we've ever seen it, anything that you see had a beginning at one time. We can't comprehend, we can't see anything that didn't have a beginning at one time. Look at everything around you and just point to one thing that didn't begin at some time. You can't do that. The only thing that we can comprehend of, and we get this from the Scriptures, is God, that He didn't have a beginning at some time. But a person would be very shallow to believe this, because his whole life, everything he looks at all around him, says that can't be, because everything you look at has a beginning. And we must be able to trace that back to matter. When did matter begin? It had to begin at some time. It couldn't have existed for all eternity, or that would make it God, in other words. Then the second philosophical view is known as pantheism. Again, looking at the word, you see theism in there, so you know it has something to do with God. What does the word pan mean? It comes from a Latin word, too. What does the word pan mean? No? What about the airlines? Pan-American Airlines. What do you think they use that word pan for? Pan-American. Across? Did someone say across? That's what it means. Across or through. Across the Americas. Pan-American Airlines. That's what the word means in Latin. Pan. It means across or through. Now you say, what does that have to do? Well, what pantheism says is that God and matter are really the same thing, since God is present everywhere. That God and matter are really the same thing, since God is present everywhere. And just get that down and then think about it. God and matter, there's really no difference between God and matter. In other words, all matter is at least an emanation or some form of God. God and matter are really the same thing, and since God has always been here, then matter has always been here. Really reasoning around in a circle, but still trying to teach the eternal existence of matter, both of these philosophical views. Now, doesn't the Bible say that God is omnipresent? Does that mean that He is inside this piece of wood? If He is everywhere, does that mean that He's inside this piece of wood? See, this is where they get pantheism. This is what the Hindus believe. That's why they won't sacrifice a cow. You'd be killing God then, because God lives in that cow. And if the Bible teaches God's omnipresence, which they've been smart enough to see, that He's everywhere, which is what all of your religions teach, that God is present everywhere, then just how present is He? If He's in something and you start burning it, then you're going to burn Him. And this is what, of course, they believe, that there has been a gradual decline in the existence of God, because every time you destroy something, you destroy part of God then. Which, see, we can't even get into that. That's in theology to find out, is God in this piece of wood here? And if you damage this piece of wood, are you damaging God then? What really does it mean whenever the Bible says that God is omnipresent? Over in Romans chapter 1. You see, most of you might have thought in the past, in reading the Old Testament and in knowing something about idols and idolatry, that people set up idols merely to represent God, and they worship the idols as a means of representation of God. But that's most of the time not true. They believe that that idol contains God within it, or that that idol actually is God. And of course that's known as pantheism. It's exactly what that's known as pantheism. But over in Romans 1, the Bible always sets the Creator over and above and against the creation. And it never mixes the two up by saying that God is creation or that creation is God. But the Bible makes makes it clear that God continually sets himself over and above and against the created order. Romans 1, the second half of the chapter, deals a lot with idolatry and some men's views on the origin of things and God himself. We see in verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image. See, it says right there that they changed the glory of God into an image, not just representing him through that image, but actually believing that he was in that image. Made like unto corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God. Now the truth that he's speaking about here is the truth of creation, that the Creator is set over and above and against the created order, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Which is a part of pantheism here. It's really all that I've got time to try to explain on this. I think that this will come up, I know it will come up again in another class when we look at different views of the existence of God. Because that's something that if you believe in the Bible and you believe in the omnipresence of God, it's something that you have to, in your own mind and from the Scriptures, come to terms and come to grasp with. What does the omnipresence of God really mean? How present is he in everything and through everything? Okay, then going on to some astronomical views, which are my favorite ones because I had every single one of these in my astronomy classes in college. We had a huge astronomy class. It was a freshman class, and of course most of your freshman classes like that are going to be just filled with people, and those poor college students just swallowing everything that was being said there. But it was very interesting to hear some of my professors come across with some of these views. The first one, and you can think back in your own mind and see which one of these or how many of these you remember, if any of them. The first one is known as the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory. We have our first hint of the Big Bang Theory beginning back in 1913 with this first fellow here that I have written down. He was doing some studies in astronomy, and what he began to see is that evidently all of the galaxies are retreating from one another. And he first of all saw this in 1913. And of course, I think it's obvious to find out or to tell what the word or the title Big Bang means. All the things that we see in the created order came about as a result of a huge explosion out in outer space at one time. And after this huge explosion took place, it sent galaxies and stars and planets hurling off in all directions at thousands, millions and millions of miles an hour. And you see, no one had thought of this until this fella began to notice that it appeared true that the galaxies were retreating from one another. Now, he didn't take that far enough to actually dream up the Big Bang Theory himself. All he did, I believe, the next year in 1914, they had a convention of some world-famous astronomers, and Vesto presented his paper at this time to show his statistics and calculations in proof of the fact that the galaxies were indeed retreating the one from the other. Then, let's see, I've skipped a fellow because I knew you would know him. Then in 1917, Albert Einstein, all of these people had something to do with the Big Bang Theory. 1917, Albert Einstein delivered his papers on the theory of relativity. Now you see, this is just 4 years later. Now this was on opposite sides of the Atlantic, and you can tell from the year we're right in the middle of World War I here. World War I's 1914 to 1919. So we're right in the middle of World War I whenever Einstein, who of course was born in Germany and later moved to Switzerland and later moved to the United States, and he was a professor at Princeton University, Right in the middle of this great world war, Einstein is posing his theory and his papers on the subject of relativity. Now, what Einstein failed to realize was that the very theories of relativity, which, by the way, are for the most part correct, they destroyed some of the laws of Newton concerning gravity and relativity that had been prevalent for 300 years, Sir Isaac Newton. But what Einstein did not see at this time was that contained in at least a germ form in his theories on relativity was the theory of the Big Bang. Now, he didn't see that at this time. He did come to see that later on. One reason he did not want to see this, and he even said it, and I have some quotes of his that he made, was that that would point back to a very beginning. If something exploded, then what happened before it exploded? And he didn't like that. Someone asked him one time, did he believe in God? And he said no, and he couldn't believe in this Big Bang theory because it meant it had a beginning at some time. And he, of course, had believed all along that matter had been, not co-existent with God. He didn't believe in God, but that matter had been eternal. And what's rarely ever known or read or heard about Einstein is that whenever he first published his paper on relativity, he made a schoolboy error in that he divided by zero. You know what that'll do if you divide by zero? And a Russian mathematician by the name of Alexander Friedman, did I write that on there? No, not as important as these other fellas. But a Russian mathematician by the name of Alexander Friedman, whenever he first read Einstein's paper, realized he divided by zero right in the middle of his theory, which you can't do that, of course, in algebra. You can't divide by zero. And this is a fact. I'm not telling you a story here, that Einstein actually did that. You know, you can get so brilliant sometimes you get absent-minded. And that's about where he had gotten evidently at this time, and had divided by zero. And his theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, of course, was still substantiated, and that still is even to today. That's how we got our atomic bomb, by the way, is the theory of relativity, E equals mc squared. But what his theory would have gone on to show, if he had not divided by zero, is that all of the galaxies must be retreating from each other. Now, all of this has to do with his theory of relativity. He would have been predicting that very same thing without even realizing it at this time. So, and he didn't realize it at this time. Our second fellow I've mentioned here, this is a Dutchman, a Dutch astronomer, Wilhelm de Sitter, began to study Einstein's paper. He first came on the scene, I believe, around 1915. He began to study Einstein's theory, wrote Einstein a letter, and showed him that his theory, that he did not want to prove the retreating of the galaxies, did that very thing. It pointed to the fact that the galaxies must be retreating from one another. And you see, if the galaxies are retreating from one another, to say that another way, what we end up with is what is known as the expanding universe. We don't have a static universe, but the universe is expanding. That is, on all directions, as far as we can think, north, south, east, and west, on all directions it's growing and it's expanding. And everything within that universe is moving away from everything else in the universe. Such as our solar system here would not be getting closer to anything. It would be getting further away to everything, and it would be doing all of this at the same time. It's known as the red shift. This is the way you can determine that things are moving from one another by looking at the spectrum of the star. And it's known as the red shift. Depending on the color of the star that it sends back to you over a period of time, you can tell that star is moving away from you, which is certainly true. We know that we're not static here in the universe, so why should anything else be? They're not. They are all moving away from one another. Now, of course, what they want to make out of this is, well, what happened when everything wasn't moving away from one another? If we reverse this, we're going to put everything back together, we're going to have that big ball, and then it exploded, and that's known as the Big Bang Theory. Now, you see, part of what they said is right. And astronomers haven't even known this. This final fella here, Hubble, who was an astronomer out in California at the famous Mount Palomar Institute. Now, Hubble was there back in the 20s and 30s. This was before they had the great telescope that they now have out at Mount Palomar. That wasn't put in there until 1948. 200-inch telescope, reflecting telescope. the largest in the world until just a couple of years ago, and the Russians built one a little bit longer than the one in Mount Palomar. But if you've ever gone outside and just taken a pair of binoculars, a good pair of binoculars, and looked at the moon, you can see craters and everything all over the moon. And if you haven't done that, get some binoculars from someone and go out there. You can see everything just right there on the surface without even using a telescope, just a good pair of binoculars. As a matter of fact, if you go out there just with your natural eye and look hard enough, you can see different shades of color on there. A lighter shade, a darker shade. Well, those are the various hills and valleys and mountains and so forth that are found on the moon. And you can see those with a pair of binoculars. Now, can you imagine what you could see if you had a 200-inch telescope? It's not something that you hold or anything. I mean, it's a huge thing that's mounted. The one that we used down at the University of Mississippi was nowhere near that large. They're very, very, very expensive, too. And the one we used was built back during the Civil War, and it's still in use today. But it's a huge thing that would maybe reach from here all the way up to that speaker up there. And to even reach the thing, you had to climb on a ladder, a huge ladder to get up on it, and that thing would stick out further than that. You'd have to climb up on that ladder. Of course, they have mechanical gear set on that thing, so it'll never lose target of the star, the moon, or whatever you're looking at. Because you see, the Earth is continually turning. If you just fix that thing on the moon or a star or something, pretty soon, of course, it wouldn't be fixed there anymore. But they know enough how to calculate the rate of turn, and they can fix that thing so when the Earth turns, that's going to turn. It's going to stay right there on whatever you want it to look at. And I just spent every Thursday night, we had to go down to the observatory, to Hale's Observatory, every Thursday night, and looked at the moon and Venus and all the planets and different stars and things like that, and bring them up so close to you, you could just reach out and touch the moon practically. It was that close to you. You could just see all types of details on there. So and that wasn't anything like the telescope out at Mount Palomar in California. With this telescope, Hubble is the one who first of all began doing some experiments at Mount Palomar. Some other people came after him once the telescope was put in 1948. And all of these men combined at the Palomar Institute and at Mount Wilson, the observatory on Mount Wilson, began to follow up some of Vesto's and some of Wilhelm de Sitter's theories concerning the expanding universe, and could substantiate and document all of these by means of their telescopes. Now, even more recently, we have the invention of what's known as a radio telescope that can reach out much, much further than an optical telescope. An optical is one that you look through with your eye. A radio telescope can pick up radio waves that come from trillions of miles away from the Earth. And there were two men, I don't have their name written down, so I'm not going to write those down for you, that just, I believe, in 65? I don't remember. In the last 20 or 30 years, these two men had built a huge radio telescope. And a lot of these things have come by way of accident. They weren't looking for any leftover remains or evidences of this great fireball that exploded and gave rise to the name of the Big Bang Theory. But whenever they set that huge telescope up, they began to get static in that thing all of a sudden. And they checked all their instruments, and the static remained there even though everything had been done correctly. And I've got pictures of them. I can show them to you here in a book that I'll show you in a moment, where they're climbing up in the thing, looking around, and finally they find some pigeons' nests built in their telescope. They get those pigeons' nests out of there, and they still have that static. And what they interpret that to be is a form of outer space radiation that is a remain of this great fireball that exploded in the Big Bang Theory. Which, of course, their interpretation of that doesn't mean that that is really part of the Big Bang Theory or part of the remains of that fireball. But anyway, this probably even today is one of the most popular views, known as the Big Bang Theory. A tremendous explosion, a fireball explosion, and we got what we have today. But again, for us, this is too shallow. What about that thing that exploded? Where did it come from then? We got to go back to when there was nothing. Unless we're just going to believe that matter is eternal. And like I said, the world around us tells us everything had a beginning at some time. So we just couldn't believe in something like that. Okay, let's see. Going on to another astronomical view. This is the most hilarious one of all of them, and I didn't think I would get it in college, but I actually got it presented in college. And it's known as the space-time theory. The space-time theory. What happened here? I think I've shared this before. What happened in the space-time theory from the origin of the universe? Space and time bumped into each other. I actually had this presented at a university. Space and time bumped into each other. Some of this may be too deep for you to follow. It's too deep for me to follow, so don't worry about it. It's over my head, space and time. That class was too large, and of course I always sat on the very last row at all my classes so I could stay to myself there, and I should have shouted down, "Will you demonstrate that for me? How you're going to bump space and time into each other?" I'd just like to see how that would work. Now I can see how you could bump a watch, something that tells time, into something else, but not time itself. How could you bump time into space? I don't know. Revelation chapter 10 and verse 6. The space-time theory. That's why this is probably my favorite one. If I was going to believe any of them, I guess I'd believe in that one. Why not? I mean, if you're going to believe in one of them, I like that space-time theory. That'd be mine to believe in, because then people would think you must be a really deep thinker or something. Revelation, pardon? No, he didn't believe in that. He believed in the Big Bang Theory. But he presented it as a very real alternative, though. Now, most professors believe in the Big Bang Theory. What did I say? Revelation 10 and 6. Well, just to show you there's going to come a time when there is no time, if I can put it that way. So it must mean that time had a beginning at some time. You see, we're such time-oriented creatures, we can hardly think or say anything without regarding time. But this concerns some of these great trumpets, the voices of the angels. We've had 6 of them already. The 7th one comes in verse 7 of Revelation 10. But in verse 6, "And swear by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer." So the Bible very clearly says that time will end at some time. Same thing is true with space. We realize that space must have had a beginning at some time. But how you're going to bump those things into each other, I don't know. I'd heard of that before, just in some of the studies that I had done before I was even in college, and I never dreamed they would actually present that as a veritable sideline view, anyway, of the origin of all things. Third view is known as the planetesimal or the encounter theory. Prior to 1940, this was very popular. Since then, it's gone down the drain, though. The planetesimal or the encounter theory, which says that a star billions and billions of years ago passed close enough to our sun one day that the gravitational attraction between the star and the sun, a very large star, pulled off pieces of the sun that later cooled off and made our planets, Venus and Mars and the Earth and Pluto and stuff like this. So it's the theory that a star went too close to the sun and pulled off part of the sun. We got our planets as a result of this. That's why it's known as the planetesimal view, because it can't answer where did the sun come from then, or that star that went by the sun. Fourth astronomical view is the nebular hypothesis. This is one of the leading theories also today. The nebular hypothesis, believed by men such as George Gamow, G-A-M-O-W, famous astronomer, and Fred Hoyle, H-O-Y-L-E, a British astronomer. The nebular hypothesis says the following. The solar system came about as a result of a huge cloud of dust and gases, very, very cold, swirling around and around in a circle. These might not sound like a lot to you, but whole textbooks are written on the nebular hypothesis. That at one time there was a huge, dark, cold, swirling cloud of gases and dust, interstellar gas and dust. And these things swirled around enough that pretty soon some balls got together and they slung off the planet Earth and the planet Mars and the planet Venus and these different planets. Let me give you some scientific responses to that one. Because it again is one of these popular ones that's believed by people today. First of all, since the sun contains 99 6/7% of the mass of the solar system, now you think about that, the sun contains 99 6/7% of the mass of our solar system, then what caused that 1/7 of 1% to break away and form all the planets? There'd be no way you could explain if this swirling huge ball of gas and dust really did exist, then how did 99 6/7% of it go and form the sun, and then only 1/7 of 1% formed all the planets? It's a 1 in a trillion chance that something like that would have taken place. Another thing you can't explain by the nebular hypothesis is the difference between the composition of your terrestrial planets and your Jovian planets. Your terrestrial planets are like the Earth. The Earth is a terrestrial planet because it's made out of hard substances. Your Jovian planets are like Saturn. You couldn't stand on Saturn, of course. Saturn is nothing but gas. So how did we end up with some terrestrial ones and some Jovian planets? And all of the unique characteristics about some of the planets that we again will be looking at later are just fascinating. The planet Venus, from 40 kilometers high, continually every day of that planet's life is raining down sulfuric acid to a surface that's already molten, just like molten lead on that surface. Now, how did that planet get like that and ours like it is today? And if they say, well, it's because, Venus is so close to the sun. You see, Venus, of course, in Scripture is known as the morning star. That's what the Bible's talking about when it says the morning star. That's the planet Venus. Well, take our planet and the planet Mars. Those are two very, very close planets. But why are they so different? Mars can't support life on it, but the planet Earth can. Why is it that the planet Earth is so unique? Of course, basically with its composition of water and oxygen there. And it has an atmosphere where, of course, human beings can survive and live, and none of your other planets have that. Too many wild chances to believe in the nebular hypothesis. Another response against it is, how do we explain what's known as our retrograde satellites? Or I can add into that our retrograde planets. We have 2 retrograde planets. Now, most of the planets spin around on their axis in the same way. But Venus and Uranus are 2 planets who spin backwards from the rest of us. Now, what made those 2 planets spin that way and the other 7 planets spin like the Earth? Now, the retrograde satellites, of course, a retrograde satellite is the moon of some planet. Don't think that our moon is the only moon. Our moon is one of 32 moons that we know about in our solar system, because various planets have various numbers of moons that go along with them. We happen just to have 1 moon with our planet. But 11 of the solar system's 32 moons are retrograde satellites. That is, they are spinning on their axis just backward to what the mother planet is spinning, which is very hard to conceive because you're going to have a gravitational attraction or force between the two, and they're going in opposite ways. You see, most of the moons of the planet spin the same way the mother planet spins, which only makes sense. As she turns this way, then the moon's going to turn this way. But how is it that we've got 11 out of the 32 moons that belong to these planets that are known as retrograde satellites, which means they're spinning opposite to the mother planet? A final response to this is, why is the Earth composed of such heavy elements? This is what the Earth is rare for, composed of very, very heavy elements. Apart from hydrogen and helium, the other elements that we have in the planet Earth and our atmosphere are extremely, extremely rare in the universe. Apart from hydrogen and helium, all the other chemicals that we have on this planet are extremely rare throughout the rest of the universe. Just take oxygen, that's extremely rare. Water, that's extremely rare. H2O, you've got oxygen there, of course. So why is it that we are composed of heavy elements, and most of the chemicals that make up the Earth and our atmosphere are simply not found? And you see, if we all came from this same swirling nebular mass, then we ought to be all composed of the same constituents. We ought to be composed alike one another. But this simply is not true. Then going on to one final one, and that is the steady state theory. Sometimes this is mistakenly called continuous creation. But really all the steady state theory is a belief in evolution continually from nothing. Didn't get nearly as far as we needed to this evening. We'll have to go quickly next time. Continuous, it's known sometimes by people, but mistakenly now, it's continuous creation. They don't believe that, in other words, they don't believe that mass is eternal. They don't believe mass came from a swirling mass of gas. They just believe it appears all of a sudden. That's where they get the name continuous creation. But we could call it nothing but continuous evolution is all that it is. They're saying something's evolving. They're just happy to say that it evolves from nothing, which amounts to creation, which is what we believe, that God made things from nothing. But the steady state theory is saying that things are continually being brought into existence just from nothing. That's why we don't have to find any missing link between the apes and man. Because there didn't necessarily have to be a progression leading from apes to man. Man could have just arisen just like that, just as a full-grown human being. Steady state theory. Not too many people really believe in the steady state theory. It gets too close in believing in creation if you believe in the steady state theory. Well, I didn't want to, but we're going to have to stop right here. Hallelujah. We wanted to get to some more of Darwin's phrases to explain them, but we'll just have to put an end here. Go quickly next time, though, on looking at some anthropological exhibits of man. It's interesting that Augustine is known, a famous quote from him even to this day, whenever he was asked, what was God doing before he made the heaven and the earth? You remember what he said? He was making hell for people like you that ask questions like that. So I think that's a good thing to remember. If anyone asks you, what was God doing before the creation of the earth and the heavens? He was making hell for numbskulls that ask questions like that.
For a complete